Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something the ancient Egyptians took surprisingly seriously, sometimes hilariously literally, and often spiritually sideways, the sex lives of their priests. Or rather, the lack thereof. Because if you think being a priest in ancient Egypt was all about divine wisdom and incense, think again. It was also about shaving everything, suppressing natural urges, and avoiding garlic like it was an STD. Welcome to the ancient world of spiritual celibacy, sacred awkwardness, and a priesthood so committed to purity that some of them couldn't even dream correctly. Before we get too deep into the linen folds of priestly restraint, take a second to like the video and subscribe, if, of course, this kind of bizarre historical storytelling is your thing. Drop a comment to let me know where you're tuning in from and what time you're falling asleep to this. There's something strangely beautiful about people from around the world bonding over sexually frustrated priests from 3,000 years ago. All right. Lights dimmed, linen tucked, let's begin. In ancient Egypt, sex wasn't scandalous. For most people it was normal, natural, unshameful. The gods did it. The pharaohs did it. Even the average farmer with 2 goats and a bad back did it. It was part of life. It was divine even. But if you were a priest, especially in service to major gods like Amun or Osiris, things got complicated fast. Because unlike the rest of Egyptian society, which treated sex as sacred, the priesthood treated sex like a spiritual landmine. The goal wasn't celibacy for its own sake. It was ritual purity. Priests weren't expected to be abstinent forever. They weren't monks. They could marry. Some had kids. But during their periods of service, which could be weeks or months at a time, they had to follow strict rules of physical, dietary and sexual restraint. Think of it like being a temporary monk with excellent posture and a dangerously close relationship with a copper razor. Every day began with a bath. Not just any bath, a ritual cleansing in cold water, infused with sacred herbs, sometimes natron, and always a healthy dose of self-loathing. After that came the shaving. Full body, every single hair, scalp, eyebrows, armpits. Yes, even there, daily. Because hair, in the priestly worldview, was a sign of mortality, messiness, and general human funk, and you couldn't serve the gods if you smelled like a person, or worse, if you smelled like onions. Garlic, onions, and leeks were all banned for priests. Why? Because they made your breath stink, your sweat worse, and your spiritual vibration drop below divine Wi-Fi standards. And if you're wondering whether you could still sneak in a romantic night with your spouse during your service rotation, the answer is absolutely not. That was a fast track to impurity, disqualification, and possibly having to sleep near the cat mummies for a week. This might all sound harsh, but there was a logic to it. Egyptian religion didn't separate body from spirit the way some later religions did. The body was a temple. Literally, a microcosm of divine order. So to serve the gods, you had to make your body as ordered, clean and controlled as possible. That meant no bodily fluids, no sudden arousal, no sex, no dreams involving either. Yes, even nocturnal emissions could disqualify you from temple service. There were purification rituals for that too, long ones, embarrassingly public. Still, priests were human, and they lived in a world surrounded by sensuality. The temple dancers, the incense, the statues of gods with exaggerated anatomy and smirks that suggested they were having way more fun than anyone in white linen. Imagine leading a fertility ritual for Hathor while standing 10 feet from a carved relief of the god Min proudly holding his phallus, like he's about to deliver a TED talk on virility. Now imagine doing it while shaved, sleep-deprived, and extremely aware of the temple musician tuning her lyre 3 feet away. It didn't help that some gods were walking contradictions. Hathor, the goddess of love, beauty, music and drunken joy, was worshipped with wine, dance and ecstatic rituals. But if a priest joined in too enthusiastically, straight to the purification chamber. Same with Bastet, goddess of sex, fertility and cats. Her festivals were lively, sensual, and occasionally got a little wild after dark. But priests were supposed to supervise, not participate. Even the origin myths didn't offer much comfort. The god Atum created the universe by, well, pleasuring himself into existence. That's in the Book of the Dead. And Osiris, murdered, chopped up, reassembled and revived just long enough by Isis to father a child before dying again. Talk about pressure. And yet these stories were considered sacred, not scandalous. They were metaphors for creation, power and cosmic renewal. But priests? They didn't get metaphors, they got checklists. During particularly holy festivals, like the Festival of Drunkenness, priests had to walk a delicate line between honouring the spirit of joy and not accidentally catching feelings. Because nothing says spiritual test like watching half the population of Thebes get wine drunk in honour of Hathor while you quietly sip your diluted beer and pretend not to notice someone grinding to a tambourine. Of course, some priests bent the rules. There are scattered records, whispers of scandals. One high priest was exiled for being caught with a temple singer. Another was reassigned to the crocodile shrine, the ancient Egyptian version of "we can't fire you, but we're making your life miserable," for sneaking out to meet a widow during his rotation. And some simply lived double lives, dutiful by day, distracted by night. But these were the exceptions, most kept to the path. Because being a priest wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a status symbol, a spiritual duty that came with its own prestige, perks, and, yes, deeply repressed desires. In the end, the sex life of an Egyptian priest was less about wild ancient romance and more about endurance. Emotional, physical, and occasionally poetic endurance. It was about walking past temptation, day after day, and whispering a silent apology to the gods for being born with a body. So tonight, as you drift off, remember, somewhere, thousands of years ago, a fully shaved man in a starchy linen kilt stood beside a statue of Hathor, holding a bowl of honey and pretending not to notice the flute player smiling at him. He was devout, disciplined, probably uncomfortable, and trying very, very hard not to think about lettuce. It wasn't just about skipping sex. Ritual purity in ancient Egypt was an Olympic sport in self-denial, and priests were expected to win gold every day before breakfast. If you thought avoiding arousal was difficult, try doing it while standing shirtless in 105-degree heat, freshly shaved, surrounded by incense smoke, and chanting hymns to fertility gods carved with anatomically enthusiastic detail. Purity meant more than not touching someone you liked. It meant not touching yourself, not sweating too much, not dreaming the wrong dream, not bleeding, not farting, not even coughing too enthusiastically during a recitation. The body was a portal to the sacred, and also a suspiciously leaky container for sin. So priests were expected to keep that container locked up tight, every orifice accounted for. The daily ritual began with a cold plunge, not metaphorically, literally. You woke up, walked to the sacred lake or basin, and bathed in chilled water infused with natron, which is essentially ancient bleach. It was said to purify the skin. It mostly dried it out. Then you shaved everything every single day. This wasn't vanity. Hair was seen as chaotic, impure, and unclean. If your armpits were sprouting or your scalp was stubbly, you might as well have walked into the sanctuary waving a pork chop. After that came linen, always white, always crisp, always scratchy. Softness was for nobility. Priests wore purity like a fabric, one that never quite fit. And while the average Egyptian family might eat onions, garlic, and fish stew for breakfast, you didn't. Anything with a strong smell or aphrodisiac properties was forbidden. That included leeks, beans, alcohol, and even some types of bread that were too spicy. Because nothing ruins a sacred recitation like accidentally sounding seductive mid-hymn. But here's the kicker. It wasn't enough to be pure. You had to look pure. Carry yourself with perfect composure. Priests were expected to glide, not walk, speak slowly, never laugh too loudly, never show anger, pain, or, heaven forbid, enthusiasm, especially not in public. Because enthusiasm looked suspiciously like pleasure, and pleasure, as everyone knew, was the gateway drug to chaos. Even marital sex had to be paused during service periods. This could mean weeks, sometimes months, depending on your rotation. If you had a wife, she had to understand. If you had no wife, well, better. Fewer distractions. But not all priests were thrilled about this arrangement. There are temple records and private letters that hint at frustrations. Vows broken, dreams too vivid, a few apologies scribbled in the margins of scrolls that somehow didn't make it into the official liturgy. One priest even carved a private prayer onto the back of a votive offering. It said, "Forgive me, Hathor, for thinking of her during the chants." The carving was discreet, but the message was clear. Suppression was not the same as peace. But that was the point. Priests weren't meant to be comfortable. They were vessels, temporary hosts for divine power. And gods, as everyone understood, were extremely picky roommates, one in pure thought, one in pure action, and the god might not show up that day. Worse, they might show up angry, and no one wanted to be on the receiving end of a disappointed falcon-headed sun deity. So the solution? Overcorrect. Ban everything. Avoid temptation. Act like your entire digestive system didn't exist. Some sects went further. The priests of Amun were known for their discipline, but the priests of Ra, fanatical. They even avoided certain words during service that sounded vaguely erotic. Not because they were inappropriate, but because someone once laughed during a hymn and was reassigned to latrine duty for a month. No one laughed after that. There's also evidence that some priests, particularly those in training, were forbidden from even witnessing acts of intimacy. If two lovers embraced near the temple wall, a junior priest might be told to fast for 3 days and recite the Book of Coming Forth by Day as penance. Imagine being 19, bald, sunburned, and trying to pretend you didn't just see a couple hold hands while you were walking back from a scroll delivery. Still, the priests endured. They had to. Because spiritual prestige was real. A priest could rise in influence, gain respect, access better tombs, be buried with more amulets, but they had to keep their robes clean, their gazes low, and their internal thoughts regulated like papyrus inventories. And that meant confronting the great elephant in the room, desire. Desire was not evil in Egyptian religion. It wasn't sinful, it was sacred. But sacred things are dangerous. They need to be contained, directed, ritualized. And in the priesthood, that meant never indulging it outside the exact prescribed moment. For most, that moment never came. For some, well, let's just say the next story we tell doesn't end with perfect self-control. Because despite everything, the rules, the rituals, the reputations, priests were still human, and occasionally they made mistakes, some small, some historic, like the infamous tale of a priest who fell in love with a temple dancer, not in passing, not in metaphor, but fully, disastrously, completely. And if you're still with me, still wrapped in linen or maybe just in blankets, we're about to explore what happens when a priest breaks his vow, not out of lust, but love. A rare, risky, quietly devastating thing in a world where even dreams could get you disciplined. Stay with me, because what comes next is the story of a man who didn't just slip once, but risked everything for a smile. There are some rules that everyone breaks eventually, even if they don't mean to. For ancient Egyptian priests, that rule was almost always the same. Don't fall in love with a dancer. It sounds obvious, almost cliché, like falling for the lead singer of a band or the person who brings you bread at dinner. But in the temples of ancient Egypt, where restraint was religion and control was power, dancers were the one thing priests were never supposed to want. And of course, that made them impossible to ignore. You weren't supposed to look at them too long. That was rule 1. They performed during ceremonies, rituals and festivals, always barefoot, always graceful, always moving just enough to keep your eyes and thoughts drifting slightly off-centre. It wasn't intentional. Dancers weren't there to tempt priests. They were there to honour the gods. Their movements were prayer, their music sacred. But the gods never had to worry about what was happening under their linen kilts. The priest did. And one priest, according to a story whispered from one scroll room to another, looked too long. He served in the house of Hathor, which was already a difficult assignment if you had a heartbeat and a sense of smell. The goddess of love, music, beauty, and joy, basically ancient Egypt's answer to a perfume commercial, was honoured with festivals full of wine, perfume, tambourines, and yes, dancing. And in the middle of it all was her temple troupe, the daughters of Hathor, trained in movement, song, and spiritual ecstasy, which is a difficult thing to pretend isn't seductive when you're standing 6 feet away holding a bowl of rose petals. Her name, they say, was Keria, young, sharp-eyed, quiet in the way that made people listen. She wasn't the most beautiful dancer in the troupe, at least not by the ridiculous sculptural standards of the time, but she was the one who never seemed to be performing for anyone but the gods. That's what drew him in. Not her hips, not her hands, but her stillness between the steps, the way she held silence like it was sacred. He was older, disciplined, known for his precision in rituals and a talent for memorizing hymns down to the syllable. He never fumbled a line, never glanced where he shouldn't, until he did. It started, as these things always do, innocently. She dropped a reed stylus near the edge of the sanctuary floor. He bent to pick it up. Their hands brushed. Nothing dramatic. No swelling harp music. Just a glance. Longer than it should have been. He returned the stylus. She bowed. He said nothing. But after that, something shifted. He started standing closer during processions. She began lingering a little longer after performances. Once she passed him a small lotus flower after a long hymn session. It was wilted, slightly crushed, but it smelled faintly of honey and dust. He kept it hidden in his satchel for 3 weeks. To outsiders, nothing happened. There were no secret meetings, no midnight confessions, no scandal. But inside the temple, silence is rarely neutral. People notice when eyes drift, when prayers take a little too long to recite, when a priest known for his detachment suddenly starts fumbling the incense burner or losing his place in the recitation of the daily offering. And eventually the high priest noticed. He asked no questions. He didn't need to. Instead, he reassigned her to a satellite temple 3 districts away. just far enough that she wouldn't return for festivals, just far enough that she'd be forgotten. She didn't protest. She bowed, gathered her robes, left before sunrise. He watched her go from the upper gallery, didn't move, didn't speak. But that night he broke the rules. He left the temple, not through the front gate but through the eastern servant passage, hidden beneath a linen cart. He walked for hours, barefoot, silent, past guards, farmers, and cats that blinked but didn't bother to follow. He reached her lodging by dawn, knocked once, then again. No answer. She was already gone. In his hand was a slip of folded linen. Inside it, pressed petals from the same lotus flower she'd once given him. No words, just a single drop of perfume. He left it on the threshold and returned before anyone noticed. The temple never spoke of it again. He kept his rank, his duties, his silence. But something in him had shifted, not broken exactly, just softened, like stone weathered by years of quiet rain. From that day on, he began walking the temple gardens alone. He stopped participating in the festival of drunkenness. He requested assignments farther from the central sanctuary, and when he did speak, it was with a gentleness that others mistook for wisdom. He still shaved, still fasted, still avoided onions and impure thoughts, but he never looked at another dancer, not once. There are stories that, years later, she returned, briefly, a guest performer at the Feast of the First Fruits, that she danced one final time in the house of Hathor, and that he watched from a distance, hidden behind a pillar, hands folded so tightly that his knuckles turned white. But that story is probably apocryphal, or maybe it's just too painful to verify. What we do know is this. After his death, when his belongings were catalogued for burial, a single item was found tucked into the corner of his funerary box. A faded lotus petal, still carrying a trace of perfume. No one questioned it. No one removed it. It was wrapped in linen and placed beside his scrolls. Because sometimes, even in a world ruled by purity and silence, memory is allowed a place in the afterlife. And sometimes, the softest rebellions are the ones we carry to the tomb. But not every priest who faltered did so for love. Some fell for something far more common, far more dangerous, and far less poetic. Lust. And in a world where even dreams could be impure, one priest's struggle to suppress his nightly visions became infamous enough to end up scratched into the wall of a storage chamber, half prayer, half confession, and entirely too relatable for anyone who's ever tried not to think about something while simultaneously thinking about it constantly. And if you're still with me, still drifting deeper into the linen folds of ancient memory, stay close, because next we're exploring what happened when a priest's own mind turned against him, and how even sleep wasn't safe from temptation. Let's talk about the dreams. The thing about celibacy is that it doesn't stop when the sun goes down. For the priests of ancient Egypt, even sleep had rules. You could fast, you could shave, you could avoid dancers, wine and onions with the determination of a man dodging every joy known to humanity. But dreams didn't ask for permission. They arrived uninvited, slipping through the cracks of ritual and discipline. And for one priest, name redacted from official records but not from whispered legend, dreams became a nightly spiritual hazard. Not because he indulged them, but because he couldn't stop having them. It started small, a flicker of a face, the outline of a shoulder, a laugh that felt like it came from another lifetime, the kind of dream you could wake from with a sigh and a splash of cold water, no harm done. But the human brain, when starved of stimulation, finds ways to entertain itself, and soon his dreams grew more vivid, more specific, more frequent, and worse, they left evidence. Because in the ancient Egyptian priesthood, it wasn't just your actions that mattered, it was your emissions, nocturnal ones in particular. A single inappropriate dream, if it resulted in, let's say, spontaneous fluid sacrifice, meant automatic disqualification from temple duties. You were considered ritually impure, no exceptions. You had to report it, purify, fast, chant, Washington. And hope no one added your name to the temple gossip slate behind the oil storeroom. For most priests this happened once, maybe twice. It was embarrassing, sure, but manageable. But for this particular priest, it became a pattern, one he couldn't explain or stop. He tried everything, slept upright, avoided even the faintest thoughts of women, refused honey, dates, anything sweet that might excite the blood, according to one elderly purification scribe with too much free time and a very creative imagination. He took cold baths before bed, read funerary texts aloud to himself, even stuffed his ears with beeswax to block out nighttime sounds. None of it worked. The dreams kept coming, not always erotic, sometimes just emotionally charged. Once he dreamed of holding hands with a woman he'd never met while standing in a barley field during the flood season. He woke up crying, then panicked, then bathed, then cried again. It became a private crisis. Publicly, he was the picture of devotion, stern, clean, quiet. But privately he was unravelling. He began sleeping less, eating less, walking through the temple gardens at night, whispering prayers to whatever god might be listening, begging not for forgiveness, but for silence. Just one night without a dream. That's all he wanted. Eventually he approached the high priest, confessed everything. He expected punishment, reassignment, maybe even exile to the crocodile temple, where difficult priests went to sweat out their sins in swampy isolation. Instead, the high priest poured him a cup of barley water, sat in silence, then told him a story of another priest decades earlier who had the same problem, who kept dreaming of a woman made entirely of blue lotus petals, who eventually disappeared into the desert and never returned. The high priest didn't smile, he didn't offer comfort, he just said, "Desire is not the enemy, indulgence is." And then he assigned the younger priest to the embalming chamber. It wasn't punishment, it was strategy. The theory was this: if the mind is filled with death all day, perhaps it will be less interested in life at night. So he spent the next season preparing bodies, washing them, packing them, reciting the rituals of protection while staring into the empty sockets of people who no longer dreamed. And strangely, it worked. For a while. His dreams faded, sleep returned. He stopped waking in shame and started waking in stillness. He rejoined temple service, walked the halls with a lighter step, even began to sing again during morning offerings, quietly, but still. Then one night, months later, he dreamed of her again. Not the blue lotus woman, but a real one, from the marketplace. He couldn't remember her name, just her voice. He woke with tears in his eyes, no evidence, just emotion, and he did nothing. No bath, no confession. Just sat there in the dark, wondering what it meant that he wasn't afraid anymore. In time he grew older, became a scribe, taught purification rites to young initiates who were still naive enough to believe discipline was a fixed state. He never told them about the dreams, but sometimes he would pause during the lesson, look at the horizon, and smile just slightly before returning to the script. Because even the priests, especially the priests, knew that the body is not a thing to be conquered. It's a river, and you can either dam it up until it breaks, or learn to swim in it without drowning. And not all priests were lucky enough to wrestle quietly with dreams. Some, like the next one we'll speak of, took action, publicly, drastically, and with consequences that reshaped his entire legacy. He didn't dream. He didn't long. He simply declared that sex, any sex, was unworthy of the gods, and he took it out on everyone, including himself. So if you're still awake, still breathing slowly, still floating just above the edge of dreams, stay with me. Because next we meet the priest who made celibacy his personal crusade and tried to drag the entire temple system with him. He didn't whisper his beliefs like the others. He didn't struggle silently. He didn't wring his hands over dreams or apologize to the gods for the occasional wandering eye. Number. This priest, his name lost to records but never to temple gossip, stood in the courtyard one morning, looked around at his fellow clergy, and declared that pleasure was weakness. He said it calmly, no shouting, no thunder, just conviction, like someone announcing the weather, or deciding not to eat grapes anymore. From that day forward he became known, quietly, reluctantly, as the one who took it too far. At first no one minded. Priests were supposed to be serious after all, detached, focused, a little repressed, ideally. But he took that ideal and ran with it, straight into the desert of denial, dragging everyone else with him. He didn't just abstain from sex, he abstained from conversation, from soft fabrics, from eye contact. He refused wine, even diluted, refused figs, refused honey, because it tasted too happy. He even refused to sleep indoors for a while, choosing instead to meditate outside near the temple's sacred pool, where mosquitoes and clarity battled for his attention. He quoted scrolls constantly, particularly the parts about self-restraint and inner stillness. If a priest was caught laughing during lunch, he would mutter a passage about discipline. If someone complimented the scent of lotus oil, he'd quietly note that olfactory indulgence was the enemy of focus. If a temple musician played something a little too upbeat, he'd raise a single eyebrow and say, "The gods do not tap their feet." No one quite knew what to do with him. He didn't break any laws, didn't violate his oaths, but he made everyone feel like they were failing by simply enjoying the daily bread and not weeping while doing it. He proposed new rules, suggested the removal of all decorative statues from priests' quarters, argued that flower garlands were spiritually distracting, lobbied for additional fasting days. At one point he even tried to get laughter formally removed from the festival of Hathor, an act that almost got him reassigned to goat bladder maintenance in the outer shrines. But here's the strange part. Some people followed him. Not many, but enough. A small group of younger priests began to imitate him, fasting more, speaking less, referring to joy as a fleeting illusion. They called themselves the Silent Line, which was little dramatic, even by temple standards, but they were sincere. They believed that indulgence diluted holiness, that to serve the gods properly, one must not only be pure, but emotionally neutral, unmoved by beauty, unaffected by pleasure, like a statue, only smellier. This might have remained a small, harmless phase, but then he gave a sermon. It wasn't scheduled, it wasn't approved. He simply stood up during the evening offering and began to speak, not to the gods, but to the other priests. He spoke about temptation, about the danger of dances, of warm food, of soft sandals. He described his vision for a truly divine priesthood, one that rejected all earthly pleasure, all softness, all warmth, one that slept on stone and woke in silence. one that had no room for lust or even fondness. He ended with a line no one ever forgot. Love is the final impurity, and it lives in the smile of the one who serves beside you. For a few seconds no one moved. Then the high priest stood up and dismissed him, not harshly, not dramatically, just firmly. He was removed from service, not exiled, not punished, just reassigned to a quiet shrine outside the city, where he could chant to the gods without distracting anyone with his intensity. And that should have been the end. But here's the thing about people who try to remove pleasure from life. They often end up being remembered far more than the ones who embraced it. Years later, his scrolls were found. Personal writings, reflections, fragments of confession. In them, he admitted that he was afraid, not of sin, not of temptation, but of wanting something he couldn't have, something he couldn't even name. He wrote about a fellow priest, one who once shared dates with him on a hot afternoon, one whose laugh he never forgot. He never acted on it, never spoke of it aloud. But he wrote that it lingered, long after the vows, long after the sermons, long after the reassignment, which is perhaps why he fought so hard. Not against pleasure, but against the memory of it. He died alone, as he wanted. His tomb was plain, no carvings, no offerings, just one line etched into the doorframe. The gods are enough. But the irony is, they weren't. Not for him, not for anyone really. Because the gods were never meant to replace human connection. They were meant to mirror it, to elevate it. And for most Egyptians, even the priests, divinity wasn't about isolation, it was about balance. That's what comes next. Because while this priest ran from love, the next one did the opposite. He found it, not in secret, not in shame, but quietly, gently, with someone no one expected. And though he never married her, never touched her, never even removed his sash in her presence, she changed everything. So if you're still with me, still breathing softly, still wrapped in the quiet of linen sheets and late-night questions, stay close, because now we meet the priest who took a wife in all but name, and found the one thing his training never prepared him for: intimacy. He never married her. That would have violated his vows. She wasn't his wife, not officially, not legally, but everyone in the temple quarter knew. They didn't talk about it loudly. They didn't need to. You could see it in the way he walked slightly slower when she passed by, in the way she folded his laundry with just a little more care than was strictly required, in the way they both paused before parting, as if savouring one last glance before slipping back into their separate, very chaste, very inconvenient lives. He was a mid-level priest in the service of Thoth, god of knowledge, scribes, and secrets, which, as it turns out, is an excellent setup for a man living a double life. Except this one didn't involve scandal. It involved restraint, the kind that turns longing into ritual and silence into affection. Her name was Pahai. She worked in the archives, one of the rare women employed by the temple system, tasked with copying spells, inventory lists, and funerary prayers onto papyrus. She was precise, quiet, wore her hair in the style of the northern provinces, smelled faintly of ink and myrrh, and for reasons no one ever quite understood, he fell in love with her while watching her organize a shelf of broken writing palettes. There was no grand moment, no stormy confession, just a slow, blooming awareness that he felt calmer around her, more himself, less like a vessel for divine order, and more like a man who had hands and thoughts, and a heartbeat that sometimes accelerated for reasons not covered in any sacred hymn. He never told her, not in words. But she knew. Of course she knew. Women always know before men do. She knew when he started choosing scrolls from the section closest to her desk. She knew when he began waiting for her to finish work before heading to the purification chamber. She especially knew the day he offered to carry her ink pots across the courtyard, despite temple policy strictly forbidding cross-rank domestic assistance. She accepted the help, but never the offer behind it, because they both understood what they were, what they couldn't be. Still, they shared things. Not beds, but benches. Not kisses, but jokes. Quiet ones, exchanged in the margins of inventory tallies and miscopied hymns. They found excuses to be near each other during festivals. He started helping her catalogue old funerary spells under the guise of spiritual literacy. She began bringing him sweetened dates during the heat of summer, claiming the high priest said they were good for memory. They never touched, not once. Not even when he brushed past her in the narrow hallway behind the library and both of them stopped breathing for a full 5 seconds. Their connection became a ritual of its own. He'd arrive at dawn. She'd already be there, pretending to check shelf labels. He'd pretend not to see her. She'd pretend not to notice him. And for the next 12 hours they would orbit each other like 2 moons around a god they never quite trusted to leave them alone. People began to notice. Whispers started. Nothing cruel, just curious. She was too diligent. He was too distracted. Once they were seen leaving the temple grounds at the same time, walking 5 paces apart, not speaking. That was enough to spark a full week of commentary from the linen washers, but no one reported them, because technically, nothing happened. And in a world where everything had a rule, they lived in the margins. He once wrote her a letter, a simple one, just a few lines, folded neatly and placed inside a discarded scroll case. It read, "I do not know the shape of your hand, but I feel it in every moment I resist the urge to reach for it." She never acknowledged the note, but 2 days later she left a dried lotus blossom in the inkwell he always used. They kept going like that for years, a shared glance, a line of poetry, a meal eaten side by side without ever speaking above a whisper. And then one day, she was gone. No scandal, no drama, just reassigned to a temple complex upriver, where scribes were needed and scrolls were crumbling, and the gods apparently had a poor sense of timing. He said nothing. When asked how he felt about the transfer, he simply nodded and said, "The work is important," then returned to his duties, chanting the same prayers, folding the same robes, standing in the same spot where he used to pause just long enough to catch her reflection in the copper doorframe. He didn't fall apart, didn't collapse into longing, he just continued, as if nothing had changed. But every now and then he would request scrolls from the temple where she'd been sent, officially for research. Unofficially, because her handwriting had a curve at the edge of the character for eternity that he could spot instantly. Years later he died with no partner, no children, no scandals. His tomb was modest, a few Shabti figures, a small jar of ink, and tucked into the folds of his burial linens a scrap of papyrus that read, "There are loves that bloom in silence. May the gods recognize what the temple could not." Some say it was in her handwriting, others say it was his, written for her, never sent. We'll never know. But what we do know is this. For all the talk of restraint, of denial, of purity, the ancient Egyptians understood that love doesn't always need consummation. Sometimes it just needs space, a glance, a shared shadow, a promise made with no words and no intention of being broken. And not every priest was so discreet. Some let things slip, not because they fell in love, but because they fell into habit. The next story is one of those. Because even in the most sacred temples, even in the most disciplined orders, there are always rumours. And sometimes those rumours involve back rooms, broken vows, and a kitchen servant who definitely wasn't just delivering bread. If you're still awake, or drifting just on the edge of it, stay close. Because next, we explore what happened when a priest got too comfortable with temptation, and the scandal that followed him to the grave. Not every priest made it to the afterlife with a clean record. Some went quietly, linen folded, scrolls in order, soul light as a feather. Others left behind a small pile of questions, and in one particular case, a scandal so awkward it ended up carved into a temple ledger next to grain storage statistics. They never said his name, just the one who was caught, which, to be fair, is probably not the epitaph you want written next to your soul's final audit. But it happened, and for once no one could cover it up. The priest in question wasn't famous. He wasn't even especially good at his job, mid-tier functionary, responsible for preparing incense during dawn offerings and occasionally organising sacred oils by viscosity. Not glamorous, but important. And for the most part he did it well, until he didn't. It started, as these things often do, with small changes. He began skipping morning baths, claiming his skin was naturally purified by piety. Then he started misplacing scrolls, getting names wrong during chants, mixing up which god received which offering. No one paid much attention. Everyone assumed he was tired, or distracted, or going through a spiritual phase which was common among priests somewhere between age 30 and full enlightenment. Then came the rumours. Someone saw him speaking with a temple servant, young, quiet, always covered in flour from the bakery annex. Innocent enough. But then someone else saw him again, and again, always near the back corridor where the extra amphorae were stored, always when no one else was supposed to be around. One day, a junior priest went looking for sesame oil. He didn't find sesame oil. What he did find was the priest, shirtless, smelling faintly of bread, and very much not alone. There were no spells for unseeing things. The report was filed quietly but swiftly. The accused priest didn't deny it. He didn't cry, didn't beg, just sat down on the floor, still half covered in ceremonial linen, and muttered something about divine loneliness, which is admittedly a poetic way to describe what was clearly just poor decision-making. The punishment wasn't physical. Ancient Egypt didn't deal with sexual misconduct the way later cultures did. There were no public floggings, no forced oaths of celibacy. He already broke that one. No exile to a mountain cave. Instead, they took away his name, not literally, but symbolically. His record was stripped, his tomb preparations revoked. He was dismissed from the priesthood, reassigned as a granary clerk, far from the temples, far from the gods, far from flower-scented temptation. That was the real punishment, not shame, but removal. Because in Egypt, where identity was everything, to be forgotten was worse than to be punished. Your name had to survive on tomb walls, on statues, on jars and amulets and scrolls, or else your soul would wander. No name meant no memory. No memory meant no afterlife. Just silence. He lived another 17 years, scribbling crop tallies on cracked tablets. No one ever mentioned the scandal, but no one invited him to festivals either. He became a shadow, a lesson, and when he died there was no ceremony, no priest to open his mouth for the afterlife, no offerings. Just a small jar of barley placed on the shelf by someone who remembered, despite everything, that once he had sung the hymns well. There's something quietly tragic about that. Not the sin, not the affair, but the exile from memory, because ancient Egypt was many things: strict, sacred, symbolic, but it was also human, and human beings make mistakes. The priesthood understood this, but it also understood the power of example, and so, when one of their own broke the rules out in the open, they didn't rage, they erased. Still, the story survived, not in official records, but in whispers between junior scribes, and more importantly in a small piece of graffiti carved into the back wall of the temple's oil chamber, hidden beneath centuries of soot and plaster. It simply reads, "Better to burn with love than to rot with duty." It's unsigned, but the carving style matches the ledger notes of the granary clerk in District 12. So maybe, just maybe, he got the last word after all. But his story wasn't unique, it just got caught. Because even among the faithful, the quiet ones, the rule followers, there were always secret lives, especially among the older priests, those who'd served for decades, who followed the rules, who smiled politely, and who, behind closed doors, sometimes formed bonds far deeper and far more complicated than the temple ever allowed. Which is where we go next, to a priest and his longtime friend. Not lovers, not brothers, but something else entirely. A bond no scroll could define. So if you're still with me, eyes soft, breath slow, temple incense fading into dreams, stay close. Because next, we explore what happens when devotion goes beyond the gods. They never called it love, not out loud. That would have been too dangerous, too modern, and far too specific for two men who had spent their lives surrounded by vows, veils, and very detailed lists of what was and wasn't appropriate within temple walls. But if you'd watched them over the years, really watched, you'd know it wasn't just friendship. They entered the priesthood together, back when the lintels of the temple were newly carved, and the ink on the scrolls still bled if you touched them too soon. They were boys then, freshly shaved, eager to impress the gods, and barely old enough to understand what they were giving up. One had a crooked smile, the other had a limp from falling off a grain cart. Together they made a strange but functional pair. One remembered the rituals, the other remembered the incense. One kept time during chants, the other kept notes on who forgot to bow. They grew up in the shadow of the columns, trained in silence, slept in adjacent cells, ate in the same refectory for 37 years. You could set your hourglass by them. When one appeared in the courtyard, the other wasn't far behind. People assumed they were just close, and they were. Close like thread and needle, like wind and sail. But also like people who had, over time, wrapped themselves around each other without realizing it. No dramatic confessions, no forbidden touches, just 100 small habits that added up to something quietly sacred. One of them, let's call him the taller one, once tried to transfer, not out of resentment, just to something different. A new assignment in a new temple, somewhere with different chants, different gods, different morning shadows. The request was approved. He packed his satchel, bowed to the high priest, walked 10 steps outside the gate, then turned around. No one ever asked why, but everyone knew. They weren't romantic in the way stories usually go. There were no stolen kisses, no love notes, no scandal. Just a shared basin in the mornings, a look exchanged across the altar during offerings, a habit of one slicing figs and leaving half for the other without needing to ask. As they aged, the temple changed. Younger priests came, the rituals grew more elaborate, incense formulas shifted, but the two of them stayed the same, predictable, reassuring. One lost his hearing, the other began speaking louder without being told. One developed a tremor in his hands, The other started helping with the finer brushwork. When one of them grew too weak to stand during offerings, the other asked the high priest if they could serve together at the back of the sanctuary. For balance, he said. Permission was granted, and so they stood, side by side, leaning on each other like aging columns in the desert heat. No one ever questioned it. In ancient Egypt there wasn't a word for what they were, at least not one the temple could safely use. The culture understood partnerships, understood devotion. But what they had wasn't built for record-keeping. It was made of pauses, glances. The fact that when one wept during the funeral rites of an old mentor, the other simply placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, which somehow said everything. They weren't above reproach. One time a scribe in training whispered that their closeness made the gods uneasy, that perhaps it was inappropriate. The next day the taller priest left a carefully copied hymn on the scribe's desk. It was about Mat, the principle of balance, and how sometimes harmony lives in things the world doesn't understand. The scribe never said another word. When the first of them died, it was sudden, quiet, in his sleep after evening chants. No ceremony, just a simple sigh, a hand folded over his heart, and a final breath that smelled faintly of lotus and dust. The other didn't speak for 3 days, not in mourning but in stillness. He still showed up, still performed his duties, still lit the lamps. But something in him moved differently, like a statue that had lost its pedestal. He requested to perform the burial rites himself. The high priest allowed it. During the mouth-opening ceremony, a rite meant to release the soul and allow it to speak in the afterlife, his voice cracked only once, just on the name. After the burial, he placed one item into the tomb before sealing it, a carved reed stylus. One the two of them had shared during their first year of training. It was worn down to a nub, practically useless, but he placed it on the chest of the linen-wrapped body like it was the most valuable object in the world. A month later, he asked to be transferred, not to another temple, just to a quieter post, maintaining the library scrolls in the back archive. He said he wanted silence, but everyone knew he just didn't want to walk past the basin alone anymore. He lived another 6 years, wrote hymns, taught initiates, spoke rarely but always kindly, and when he died they buried him with full rites next to the other. The records don't say much, just 2 names side by side, no mention of love, no mention of anything unusual, but among the scribes there's a quiet tradition. If you visit the tomb and leave a piece of reed, it's said the breeze through the temple corridors will hum a little louder that day. A hymn with no words, a prayer with no God. Just memory, carried like a secret. Because even in a world built on rules and rituals, some stories live between the lines. And not all priests were so lucky. Some never found love, not in silence, not in secret, not in anything. Some lived entirely alone and died that way too, still faithful, still pure, but wondering if maybe they'd misunderstood what the gods actually wanted. And that's where we go next, to a priest who followed every rule, every fast, every ritual, and died wondering what it was all for. If you're still awake, or hovering just between thought and dream, stay with me, because next we meet the priest who never broke a vow, but maybe should have. He never slipped, not once, not in word, not in ritual, not even in thought, at least not that he ever admitted. Of all the priests who served under the House of Life in Thebes, he was the cleanest, the quietest, the most alarmingly consistent. Every bath taken before the sun rose, every linen robe folded with obsessive symmetry. He even refused to sleep facing west, claiming it was disrespectful to the dead. unless one was actually planning to join them that night. He began his training at 13. By 17 he had memorized all 750 lines of the daily offering liturgy. By 20 he was correcting the pronunciation of older priests under his breath. Not out of arrogance, just precision. His world was made of rules, and in that world he was perfectly at home. Celibacy for him wasn't a sacrifice. It was a framework, a system that made life less messy, less emotional, less uncertain. Desire was a distraction. Romance was a story peasants told each other between harvests. Intimacy was for married couples and unguarded moments, and he had no use for either. The others called him the alabaster one, not because of his skin, but because he seemed carved from stone, always still, always controlled, always pristine. If a dancer walked past the temple with a veil too sheer, he looked away before she arrived. If a young priest blushed during the hymn to Hathor, he would quietly assign them 3 extra purification shifts. If anyone so much as joked about the pleasures of figs, he reminded them that indulgence led to impurity, and impurity led to chaos, and chaos was the enemy of Ma'at. He served for 46 years, never once broke his fast, never once missed a ritual, never once complained when the Nile flooded too early and ruined the walkway to the purification pools. He just adjusted his sandals and walked through the mud like a man determined not to be undone by something as petty as nature. And yet, near the end, something shifted. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic moment. Just a slow awareness that his years were growing short, and that no one really knew who he was beyond the linen and the rules. He noticed it first in the silence. When he performed morning chants, fewer voices joined in. The young priests admired him, yes, but from a distance. They emulated his discipline, but not his life. No one sat beside him during meals. No one brought him honey cakes during festival days. He began to wonder whether purity had, somewhere along the line, become a wall instead of a path. One night, as the moon rose over the temple courtyard, he stood alone beside the sacred pool and watched the reflections ripple in the breeze. For the first time in decades he felt unsure. Not guilty, just hollow. He thought of the priest who'd laughed too much and been reassigned, the one who loved without touching, the one who got caught. He had outlasted them all. But he realized he couldn't remember the sound of their voices, only their errors, only their lessons. He started attending funerals more often, not because he had to, but because he wanted to hear what people remembered. Some priests were remembered for their kindness, others for their singing, one famously for being able to recite healing spells while carrying 3 amphorae at once. But no one said, "He followed every rule." That wasn't a story. That was an obituary. One morning he sat beside a junior scribe during offerings. The boy was nervous, hands shaking, voice cracking on every other word. Afterward, the scribe apologized profusely, bracing for correction. But instead, the priest just nodded and said, "Your fear is honest. That honors the gods more than perfect breath control." It was the kindest thing he'd said in 10 years. He began changing small things, helping carry water jugs, smiling when people passed, asking questions about lives he'd never thought to ask about before. Quietly, imperceptibly, he softened, still celibate, still pure, still flawlessly dressed. But something behind his eyes had let go. The high priest noticed, asked him one evening if he was well. He replied, "I'm beginning to think I might have misunderstood the gods." The high priest didn't ask what he meant. A month later, he fell ill. A slow kind of illness. The kind that gives you time to think and time to regret. He didn't ask for medicine, didn't summon anyone. just lay on his mat watching dust float through the beams of morning light. One of the junior priests came to sit with him, awkwardly, hesitantly. The old priest asked him to bring something from his cell, a small bundle of papyrus scraps bound with twine, poems, tiny ones, fragments, really, written over the years and hidden in the folds of his mat, about the moonlight on the temple walls, about the smell of bread at dawn, about a woman he'd seen once in the marketplace who never spoke but looked at him like she knew all his secrets. The junior priest blinked. "You wrote these?" He nodded. The boy asked, "Why didn't you share them?" The old priest smiled faintly. "I was busy being flawless." He died that night. No fanfare, no divine lightning, just a breath that didn't return. They buried him with honours. He had, after all, followed every rule. But they also placed his poems in the tomb, not as spells, just as truth. And somewhere in the necropolis, carved faintly into the wall of his burial chamber, someone inscribed a line that doesn't appear in any official text. It reads, "To serve the gods is good. To feel the wind is better." No one claimed responsibility. But the junior priest started writing poetry not long after. And now we arrive at the final story. One that doesn't belong to a single priest, but to the system itself. Because if you followed us this far, you may be wondering how such a rigid world could survive so many contradictions. How the same society could worship sex, restrict it, sanctify it, fear it, and somehow still call it holy. So if you're still here, still resting, still listening through the veil of sleep, let's take one last step together. Because next we'll explore the truth behind the celibate priesthood, and why, in the end, not all vows were what they seemed. The thing no one tells you about the celibate priesthood in ancient Egypt is that it wasn't. Not really. Not always. Not in the way we think. Because while the rules were written in ink, the exceptions were carved in stone, quietly, discreetly, and often with a wink from the gods themselves. Yes, priests took vows. They bathed twice a day, shaved everything, wore white linen, slept alone, refused beer, garlic, and women, on paper. But power bends rules, especially when it's cloaked in incense and divine authority. And in the golden corridors of certain temples, some priests didn't just bend the rules, they rewrote them. Let's begin with a simple fact. Celibacy was never about morality. Not in ancient Egypt. It was about ritual cleanliness, physical, symbolic, and temporary. A priest was required to be pure when entering the presence of the gods, not necessarily every hour of the day. There were entire calendars for when certain behaviours were allowed or forbidden. Abstain during a festival. Abstain before the full moon. Abstain before offering the gods sweet cake. But afterward, that was negotiable, especially if you were important, high-ranking, connected. Take, for example, the Temple of Amun at Karnak, one of the largest, wealthiest religious centres in the ancient world. It employed hundreds of priests, and while many of them lived like ascetics, a significant number did not. There are records, real ones, etched in stone, of priests who had wives, children, property. Some even lived with their families inside temple grounds. Their celibacy wasn't permanent, it was strategic, and no one seemed terribly scandalized. Because the gods, as it turns out, were surprisingly practical. In fact, some rituals required sexual symbolism. The daily temple rite included anointing the god's statue with scented oils, a gesture that echoed not just cleanliness, but intimacy. Priests were instructed to speak sweetly to the divine image, to offer food, incense, and affection, as if tending to a beloved partner. the boundary between worship and seduction was at times uncomfortably thin. And then there were the oracles. Some priests served as mouthpieces for the gods, speaking in trance-like states, delivering divine messages. These oracles were often treated like rock stars. People brought them gifts, offerings, requests for blessings, fertility, healing, and sometimes, according to temple rumour themselves. There are no official records, of course, just hints, notes in private letters, graffiti scratched into the backs of stone lintels. The gods smiled upon her, and so did his servant. One particularly well-documented case involves a priest in the Ptolemaic period who fathered 5 children while still in service. When questioned, he claimed the god had blessed his union, and that he only abstained during official rituals. His superiors nodded, approved, promoted him. He later funded the construction of a shrine. To fertility, it's almost poetic. And then there's the matter of the gods' wives, the high priestesses of Amun, often royal women who held immense religious power. Though technically celibate, some are believed to have had discreet relationships with temple priests. A few even adopted children. Officially, they were spiritual heirs. Unofficially, well, bloodlines don't extend themselves. And this is where the myth of the celibate priest begins to unravel, because the image we have of the lonely, untouched servant of the gods is only part of the story. The other part is more complex, more human, more Egyptian. This was a culture that celebrated life, that built temples to pleasure, poems to passion, spells to enhance desire. Sex wasn't hidden, it was sacred, natural, practical. Even the gods had libidos. Min, the god of fertility, was depicted in a state of permanent celebratory readiness. Hathor presided over dance and delight. Isis wept with love and reassembled her dead husband's missing part with divine craftiness. In this world, celibacy wasn't about shame, it was about timing, and in many cases about appearances, because a priest who appeared pure brought honour to the temple, a priest who was known to be pure brought prestige, but a priest who actually was pure all the time, rare. And often very, very lonely. That's the quiet truth behind the vow. It wasn't a test of endurance. It was a negotiation with the divine. Serve with devotion. Stay ritually clean. And in return live a life not of denial but of discretion. Because as much as the gods were powerful, they were also deeply familiar with the complexities of desire. They didn't punish priests for being human. They just preferred it not be mentioned in the monthly ledger, and so the system endured. A priest could bathe 3 times a day and still think of someone while he dried his feet. He could recite hymns with perfect breath control and still remember the curve of someone's voice from the marketplace. He could swear fidelity to the gods and still sleep next to a wife, so long as he didn't smell like her during offerings. It was in the end a culture of contradictions, where rules mattered, and so did knowing exactly when to bend them. So as we close this story, this long, strange, strangely intimate journey through the lives of ancient Egyptian priests, maybe the final lesson isn't about sin, or purity, or even sex. Maybe it's about understanding. That behind the rituals, behind the chants, behind the vows and the white linen and the shaved heads, there were people, flawed, funny, tender, lonely, human, and that the gods they served were just as complicated. If you've made it this far, if your eyes are heavy and your thoughts are soft and the world feels just a little quieter than before, thank you for staying with me. If you enjoy drifting through history like this, wrapped in linen, incense, and odd little facts about divine fertility statues, go ahead and like the video, maybe subscribe, but only if it feels right. I'll be here next time either way. For now, sleep well, And remember, the gods are watching, but they're probably too polite to mention anything. If you're still here, still blinking slowly in the dark while the soft weight of history settles over your thoughts, thank you, really. Whether you listened wide-eyed or drifted in and out like a reed boat on the Nile, I'm glad you joined me. If you made it all the way to the end, maybe leave a like or subscribe, only if it feels right. No pressure, just a small gesture, like placing a lotus blossom at the feet of a statue. And now, let the past fade gently behind you, like footprints in desert sand. Let the voices of ancient priests grow quiet. Let the incense curl and vanish. You're safe. You're still. And the sands of time will keep you warm until morning.